Hey guys, welcome tonight. My name is Connor Mack. I'm with InterVarsity here at Rose-Hulman. And this whole week is going to be a focus on engaging truth and what that means. Tonight's going to be a discussion on absolute and relative truth. But we're going to be going through, this kind of our theme for the week. We have a couple other events planned, which I will talk about at the very end of tonight. But tonight we're going to have a discussion about absolute versus relative truth, which is a pretty big discussion in contemporary philosophy and just culture in general right now. And so today we have Dr. Luegenbiehl and Dr. Cornwell here. They're going to be discussing for us. How this is going to work is I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and each present their own case for relative or absolute truth. Dr. Luegenbiehl will be arguing for relative truth and Dr. Cornwell for absolute. And so they're going to go through that, talk about the case for each, and then I'll go through and give different questions that have been used to support or to try to discredit either opinion. They'll have a chance to respond from their respective opinions or positions. And then at the end, I'll give them a chance each to wrap up. And we're probably going to spend like 4 to 5 minutes or so per response. So to start off, I'll let you go first, Dr. Cornwell, if you can explain a bit who you are and what experience you've had with this discussion.
Okay, my name is Phillip Cornwell, and I have no experience with this topic. I simply said yes when Arden asked me, so thank you. So again, I have no claim to be an expert in philosophy. As far as my background, I do consider myself reasonably intelligent, so I've read about the topic, and I had straight A's in high school, straight A's in college. I have a bachelor's degree from Texas Tech. And after that, I got an NSF fellowship where I went to Princeton and got my PhD. My freshman year in college, I became a Christian. And that's when I actually started thinking more about worldviews and philosophy. So I've read about worldviews. I've read about more philosophy of science as opposed to philosophy in general. I've read a little bit of Kierkegaard, a little bit of Augustine, but really not very much. So, to be perfectly honest, this past week I've read more philosophy than I ever had in my entire life. And I realized that it's really a confusing topic, and all the different theories of knowledge and criteria for truth. And so I've decided all I'm going to be able to do with you is just share what I believe to be true. And I'm really nervous being up with Dr. Luegenbiehl, who's a professor of philosophy. So it was made very clear to me that this is not a debate. Okay, this is simply an opportunity to share what we believe on these various topics. So that's who I
am. I'm Heinz Luegenbiehl, and I do teach philosophy here. But unlike Dr. Cornwell, I haven't read any philosophy in a lot of years. Not a problem us being on an equal level in terms of that. I also went to school in Texas, but I actually went to Texas Christian University, and unlike those devils in Red Raider country. But clearly I do have some background in thinking about various theories about truth and all those kinds of things. But as I mentioned to Dr. Cornwell, I don't consider my job tonight to be representing my own beliefs and positions, but rather to put forward a case for relativism. I'll have a couple of more things to say about that at the end of the discussion. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Cornwell, how would you define absolute truth? How could you prove it, and what implications does it have for our day-to-day life?
Okay, how would I define relative absolute truth? I'm going to be using notes here. I'm not an expert. So I actually looked it up and found definitions I liked. But I didn't come up with these myself. So absolute truth is an unalterable and permanent fact. Absolute truths correspond to and correctly represent something objective in reality, They are not subjective creations and are independent of the minds that discover them. So that's what I would call absolute truth. Relativism is a philosophical doctrine that all criteria of judgments are relative to the individuals and situation involved, and manifests itself in statements like, that may be true for you, but that's not true for me. We've all heard things like that. I do think statements like, there are no absolute truths make no sense, because there are no absolute truths, and that statement's not absolutely true, which means there could be absolute truths, which violates that statement. So I think you can say, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's absolute truth, or from the evidence I see, there's not absolute truth. But so sort of definitive statements, I think, are stupid. So I shouldn't have said that. So how do you prove absolute truth? I think that's a silly question. Because if you could prove absolute truth, people wouldn't have been trying and discussing absolute truth for the last 2,000 years or 3,000 years, or whatever people have talked about. So I don't think you can prove it. But I did ask my kids. I said, how do you know if something's true? How do you know it's absolutely true? And they said, well, Dad, if Mom tells us it's probably true. If you tell us it's probably a lie. Which really made me reevaluate my whole parenting strategy. I'm not sure how it relates to this discussion. But I do think there's a significant difference between saying there is absolute truth, which I strongly believe, and saying I know what that absolute truth is. I think that's a much harder question. And the study of knowing things is what's called epistemology, which again I've also learned recently. And most of the theories of epistemology seem to start with three presuppositions. One is that there's something out there. There is objective reality. Second one is the law of non-contradiction. In other words, you can't say there's a God, there's not a God. They both can't be true because they can contradict each other. Law of non-contradiction. And the third presupposition is that our minds are capable of knowing truth. Now, I think philosophers have thrown out one or more of these in a number of different cases, but I think generally those don't lead to anything useful and generally lead to nihilism. And personally, they lead to despair. I spent a lot of time reading about the BIV problem. Anyone know what the BIV problem is? Brain in a vat. In other words, how do I know that I'm not a brain in a vat? And this is just all an illusion to me. And page after page after page, I was reading about the brain in the vat. And if I don't know I'm not a brain in the vat, and brain in the vats don't have hands, I don't know whether or not I have hands. And I just eventually gave up on that line of discourse and just realized there's just a whole lot of strange philosophy discussions out there that I'm just not privy to. So my main thought on how do you prove it is I think we can prove it because there is a God. And I think God is absolute truth. So if we're just extremely complex biochemical things, then I don't think there's any reason to suppose that the perceptions I'm receiving with this materialistic thing has any correlation to objective reality. So I think there needs to be something outside the box, if you will. To me, that's God. And I think God has created us to know things, and I think He's created the world that can be known. So to me, that's how, not how we prove it, but how we know and can know absolute truth. And the third question is, what implication does it have for day-to-day life? I think the three implications of absolute truth are ethics. In other words, I think absolute truth, there being a God, gives us a foundation for ethics. If ethics is simply based on culture, then I think there's nothing to prevent it from being completely arbitrary. Or why don't we just kill all Hispanic mechanical engineering professors, which would be me. So I don't think there's a foundation for that. But if it's based on God, in other words, God created people in His image and they have value and they've been imbued with life, then it makes sense not to do that. Okay? Second area is epistemology, how do we know things? Third area, I think, is the area of significance. And again, I think people have value. We're different than rocks because we have been imbued by God who created it in His image. So the three areas I think it has implication is ethics, epistemology, and significance.